Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.
Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of the Playing at Business podcast. I'm your host, Steve Reece, and today we're going to be looking at the ever-popular category of action figures and fashion dolls. So historically, these two powerfully performing toy categories have been prime drivers in the toy industry. But in recent times, we've seen significant change and challenge, so I thought it would be interesting to look at this in a podcast episode. So, I guess as a start point, for decades really, the categories of action figures and dolls have been pivotal in terms of the global toy industry because they're most closely linked with movies and movie licensed toys. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you may have heard the previous episode of this podcast where we look specifically at movies and toys. So, I guess the reason for the link should be fairly obvious in that clearly a toy version of the leading characters of a much-loved movie should be appealing to, people who are interested in the film, especially if they're children. So, although dolls and figures have been around for far longer than, I guess, mass-market movie merchandising, historically speaking, there's been figures found from ancient Rome or even longer before that, albeit made out of perhaps ceramic, stone or wood or some other material versus today's predominantly plastic. So, there must be a fundamental play pattern here which has caused the longevity of these toys. Aside from anything that's debatable, that really can't be debatable. I think we should also make the distinction between a doll or a fashion doll and an action figure. So these are kind of terms that are predominantly used within the industry. Historically, they've largely been about gender differentiation. So, for instance, when G.I. Joe launched in the USA, the makers Hasbro did not want to call it a doll because they thought boys won't be interested in dolls because dolls are something that's for girls. Obviously, this is a historical perspective, and the attitudes have changed as far as gender labeling of toys are concerned to a degree. But we're basically looking at however you describe it, you're basically looking at a toy, which is a depiction of a human being or, some other character. That's really what it is in essence. So dolls and action figures, kind of the accepted descriptions. So I guess if we take a look at the benefit of play with figures, dolls, whatever you want to call them, and role-playing is something that particularly springs to mind. Now, some people may think of role-playing as, putting on a costume, taking on a physical persona, and using equipment of some kind for that purpose. I guess, though, you'll also find that children will kind of take figures and set up scenes and enact a kind of an environment, almost like a scene in a play or a movie, in order to help to express themselves and explore the relationships between different characters and how to talk to each other and also how to understand the broader world and other people in it. So I guess I think one of the things historically you'll find is parents have not always been very quick to embrace the value of this kind of play. But actually, the more we get into excessive screen time and the more we start to have really strong research about the developmental stages that children go through, we can identify that actually this type of play, although it may seem very childish and almost silly, even ridiculous, it's actually really important because it's how children understand how to behave and how to communicate. They're still developing and learning. So, perhaps, especially with the need for toys to be a kind of a screen time antidote nowadays, this kind of play is actually really beneficial for kids. So I guess, historically parents may have labelled these kind of figure or doll toys as just sort of, to use an expression I've heard often in in consumer focus groups, plastic crap. Much as it pains me to say, you do hear that. And, some may seem a bit tackier or more commercial than others, and some may be generally more to parental liking than others, but they can and do play a key role in the development of children, basically. I think one of the major changes in this category is actually a reflection of society itself. If I think about my own lifetime, I was born in the mid-70s, effectively a child of the 80s, and although the UK where I was brought up had a multicultural kind of environment, especially in cities, which is where I was primarily raised, there was still tension, there was still lack of understanding, there was a lack of normalisation about, I guess, race and ethnicity relations, but also about gender and the role of the two main genders. And I guess in the end, toys will tend to depict what people will buy. So if, historically parents have primarily been looking for something that reinforces gender stereotypes that we may now consider frankly out of date, that's really what the toy industry is likely to reflect. So, we've obviously seen a change in terms of the social acceptability of gender stereotyping, and, the labelling of toys with a particular gender is, I wouldn't say it's entirely gone, but it's mostly gone. Even though the reality is, frankly, at this point in time, action figures are still overwhelmingly played with by boys, children of the male gender, and fashion dolls are still primarily played with and bought for females. So I guess historically speaking, before all the political correctness came to the fore in the way that toys depict people, and almost, I guess, arguably the way people should be, action figures had got more and more muscular and kind of rough and tough over time, reflecting that kind of macho stereotype for boys. Fashion dolls have become more and more pink over time, as if to say, anything that's pink is for girls. And I think one of the key things is where the internet and the social media revolution gave a platform to kind of aggressive political correctness, and gave a platform for public shaming, I guess, of those perpetuating these gender stereotypes. So, as a result, retailers, at least previously in certain markets, still with us thankfully in some Toys R Us, changed the signage from girls and boys to fashion dolls and action figures. Now, the reality is, and I prefer to deal in reality, if you go into Toys R Us, or if you did go into a Toys R Us, if it's no longer in your markets, you will find confused parents going, "Where's the boys aisle? Where's the girls aisle?" I saw that in a Toys R Us near to me. So it's not that this battle has been won, or this process of kind of delabelling, removal of gender labeling for toys. It's not a finished process, so it's still ongoing. And obviously, those people like myself who were, became parents in, say, the 90s or the noughties, we were raised in a time with different values and different perspectives, and so even if this kind of situation completely disappears eventually, it will still take another decade or two at the least before that happens. So just to kind of use some examples of how kind of stereotype toys have changed in the last decade or so, I think the biggest example would have to be Barbie. Now, Barbie became a bit of a kind of a figure of hate after being, a much loved toy icon for decades because of a couple of reasons. One, because in terms of ethnicity, obviously Barbie is, or has been, primarily white. And also though, in terms of kind of body style, body shape, fashion, all that kind of thing, the kind of the blonde, buxom stereotype, with the thin waist, all these things are actually seen to be helping to create body image issues for girls and then eventually women, which is obviously not a good thing if you believe that is the case. So I think actually Mattel's reaction to this, and I guess the counter action to the social media kind of pain that they were feeling has actually been quite inspiring. And, frankly, in terms of pure brand identity and brand equity, you might say that to move away from the blonde, buxom kind of California girl thing is actually a dilution of brand. But actually it's a broadening of commercial appeal as well. You're making Barbie for many more people, because it's, you'll now much more easily find a version of Barbie that looks like many more kids. So, I think Barbie is quite a good example of some of the challenges in this space, and also how companies have kind of moved with the times. I think sometimes the toy industry gets a very tough time because we're talking about children, and obviously our children are a very emotive issue, and something people are very, very passionate about. But I think you would have to accept that sometimes the toy industry even needs a nudge. Look, things have changed, kind of thing. And I think the toy industry as a whole has definitely reacted very well there. For instance, Lego with their hugely successful minifigures, Blind Bag Collectibles, suddenly had a disabled character in a wheelchair. All these kind of things I think are a reflection of how society has changed, and how much more inclusive society is heading towards being, at least in the kind of the ideal scenario, which in the end a toy should probably represent. So I think the other area that's been really interesting to look at is collectors and figures and dolls for adults. So there's always been a niche market for adult collectors, Barbie, G.I. Joe and Action Man, these things. Back in the day I actually conducted a research study on Action Man adult collectors, which was very interesting, but it was clearly very, very niche. It was a small niche, and you would say that the occasional version which Hasbro made for collectors then was selling a fraction of what the main commercial versions would sell. But kind of fast forward to today, and one company in particular has kind of revolutionized that whole thing of adult collectability, and cool for adults as well as kids, and that's Funko. So if you don't know very much about Funko, there's a fantastic Netflix documentary currently doing the rounds, so I'd recommend you to find out more about the company if you don't know them, but also watch that Netflix documentary, because even for those people in the industry, you'll learn quite a lot, as much as anything actually, about how a different consumer can be appealed to than just, I guess, the traditional market of boys and girls of a certain young age. So Funko kind of have this broad range of really stylized figures on popular, but also on some more niche licensed characters, and some of their own as well. And I estimate, this is very rough because I'm never too sure whose data is more robust than anyone else's. So, but I would estimate that Funko now account for maybe in the region of 8 to 10% of the global action figures market, according to my calculations. If anyone knows otherwise, please feel free to let me know, and I will update this somehow in the show notes perhaps. But yeah, this trend may be to a degree subject to fashion or the taste of a particular moment in time, but there's something fundamentally collectible about movie and TV based licensed toys. The people are really into the shows they like, they're really into the movies they like. So I guess you could probably expect to see more figures of YouTube stars and new content stars in general going forward, although we don't really seem to be there yet. But yeah, it's a really interesting move, and I guess that's the other thing which has changed in terms of toy companies' ability to reach consumers, with crowdfunding and all these other platforms really opening up what used to be kind of territory held by gatekeepers in toy companies and also in retail. It's it's a good thing. So I guess in summary, the future for fashion dolls and action figures. Actually, one thing I'd be very interested in is if I've been in the toy industry for just over 20 years, and this kind of change of approach to gender and all these kind of things has happened in that time. I'd be really interested to know if over the course of the time, that I've been in the toy industry, the gender labels have gone, if in the next 20 or more years, we'll actually see some kind of merging of fashion dolls and action figures, whether they'll just become fashion figures or action dolls, I don't know, but we'll see how that goes. Something tells me the innate kind of gender bias of people, whether kind of explicitly mentioned or otherwise, may stand in the way of that, but we'll see. But putting any kind of right or wrong moral judgment about gender labeling and all that kind of stuff, it's really clear that there has been some change in the last few years to what can be appealing for children and even adults. Heroes don't necessarily have to be ultra macho and ultra muscular. They can maybe be funny or cheeky or or cutesy. Heroines don't necessarily have to be soft, and they don't necessarily need to be princesses. Wonder Woman would be a classic example of that from recent times. Movies like the Black Panther, as well as Wonder Woman, have also shown that Hollywood can enjoy commercial success, I guess, based on societal change, from bucking the trend of the typical superhero, and therefore the potential is for a kind of a new path for action figures and doll, fashion doll categories in toys. But frankly, just to keep it real, like I say, the majority of parents today were born in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So these parents and their attitudes were developed and at least partly influenced by old thinking. So toy companies are going to have to walk a tight kind of line between reflecting what parents are looking to project onto their kids, rightly or wrongly, and the kind of prevailing political correctness of the day. If you get it wrong one way, you're going to lose sales because you're not going to be appealing enough to what people are looking for. But if you get it wrong the other way, you can get an angry backlash by people who are, trying to promote change in society for often for very positive reasons. So like I said earlier, I think the reality is it will take another generation or two for the current situation to shift towards a genuinely gender neutral mindset. If, and that's a big if we can say that the play preferences of boys and girls are very much based on nurture. So the classic psychology debate with children is, do they learn by nurture, by what they're taught, by what they see, by what they observe, and by what they're conditioned to do? Or is it natural? Is it just the way they are? And that's really the crux of that whole gender debate is, once you take out gender labelling, once you take out telling a child they have to play with a particular toy because of their gender, actually, do they still choose the stereotypical types of toys you would expect? And frankly, my feeling at the moment, having conducted 1,200 plus focus groups with kids and all kinds of other market research studies on this area, is that the vast majority of kids would still go with the stereotypes at this moment in time. So okay, don't label it because it's it's probably arguably wrong morally. It's certainly going to make you unpopular and cause you a whole load of negative friction. But also it's perhaps not even necessary, bearing in mind the prevailing purchase habits and gifting habits of the day. So I guess though the reality is, all this aside, dolls and figures have been around for millennium and they're really not going away. So in a sense, I think the future is strong for this category. Yes, it's going to have, toy companies will have to embrace change. But I think even the fact that Funko, who've come up in my own time in the toy industry, have reached nearly $500 million or probably heading over that now, $500 million of sales in effectively niche adult collecting, which over time has probably morphed into some kid collecting, shows that there's a lot of room for innovation and for challenging the status quo in this space. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see what happens next in these categories. So that's my look at fashion dolls and action figures. As ever, please feel free to get in touch if there's any particular area or category you'd like us to look at in this podcast. If you want to find out more about what we do, you can check out our toy business consultancy business at www.kidsbrandinsight.com. We'll be happy to talk to you if we can help your business. And we'll hopefully see you on the next podcast. Thanks and bye for now.
Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.